Late August 1945. Bad Tölz, Bavaria. The town sits at the foot of the Bavarian Alps, close enough to the mountains that on clear mornings the snow line is visible from the main street. The buildings of the former SS officer candidate school, the SS-Junkerschule, stand behind a low perimeter gate at the valley's edge. White-painted facades, pitched roofs, windows undamaged. For most of a decade, this had been among the most selective military academies in Germany, the institution that shaped line officers for the Waffen-SS, men who went on to command regiments and divisions on fronts from Finland to Crete. The last class graduated in the spring of 1945. The school closed when the army it served ceased to exist. Now, the flag above the gate was American, and the name on the office at the end of the main corridor was General George S. Patton Jr., a Wehrmacht general, was being escorted through the front entrance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from today. He carried himself in the way that senior officers of that generation tended to carry themselves even in defeat. Back straight, expression composed, the bearing of a man who had spent his career being observed and had learned to perform even the act of stillness. He was brought through the outer rooms, past the American staff officers in the corridor. He did not render a military salute. The accounts preserved by Patton's staff from that summer describe a general who did not require significant deliberation before issuing orders, and he did not deliberate on this one. The German general would render the proper military salute correctly before any further business took place. This was not a gesture of conquest. It was not a symbol of subjugation. It was what one general officer owed another when entering his headquarters, and it would be observed. The German general rendered the salute. What followed in the accounts from that period was a conversation, not a tribunal, not a lecture on the consequences of National Socialism. A conversation between two senior officers about specific campaigns, specific decisions, the performance of specific formations. Patton asked questions. The German answered. The meeting ended with the same formal military courtesy it had begun with. It sounds unremarkable. A point of protocol insisted upon. Two professionals talking about events that were over. But the pattern that moment belonged to, the pattern Patton had been building in Bavaria since the German surrender in May, was anything but unremarkable. In understanding it requires going back 1 year to the moment when the largest and most destructive army Patton would ever command was turned loose on the European continent. The 3rd United States Army was activated on the 1st of August, 1944, near the town of Nihu in Normandy, during the breakout from the Bocage country. The ceremony was brief and informal. Patton arrived, addressed his assembled staff in terms that were not suitable for publication in the division newspaper, and the army was at war. From that morning until the German surrender on the 8th of May, 1945, 3rd Army would advance the better part of 600 miles, cross 5 major rivers, liberate or capture more territory than any other American formation in the European theater, and take more prisoners than any comparable Allied army in the campaign. Those figures come from the 3rd Army After-Action Summary compiled by Patton's operations staff in the weeks following V-Day and preserved in the operational records of the National Archives. The performance they document was not the product of superior equipment. The Sherman tanks of 3rd Army were outgunned by the Panther and Tiger formations they encountered regularly in the Lorraine and the Ardennes, a fact appearing in unit after-action reports with monotonous regularity through the fall of 44. It was not the product of exceptional supply. Patton spent much of the campaign in open conflict with Eisenhower's headquarters over fuel allocations, sometimes advancing his formations beyond the reach of resupply and forcing them to sit and wait while the logistics system caught up. The performance was the product of doctrine. Specifically, Patton's belief that speed and initiative would defeat a professional enemy faster than firepower alone, and that the officer empowered to act without waiting for orders from above was worth 3 officers who were not. When it worked, and from August of 44 through May of 45, it worked with a consistency that impressed even the enemy. It produced the kind of operational results that made names in France and Luxembourg and Germany into fixed markers in American military history. The Falaise encirclement in August of 44 where Third Army's southern pincer closed the pocket before the German command structure fully understood what had happened. The Moselle crossing in September. The fighting through the Sarre-Moselle Triangle in the fall, where Third Army ground through prepared German defenses in some of the worst terrain in the Western campaign. And in December, the Ardennes, when the German offensive through the Eifel encircled the garrison at Bastogne. Roughly 18,000 American soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division and attached formations. Third Army's 3 Corps turned 90 degrees from its axis of advance, reorganized a moving column into an attack, and covered approximately 100 miles of frozen, enemy-contested ground in 72 hours. The relief elements linked up with the Bastogne garrison on the morning of the 26th of December, 1944. 3 Corps' after-action report documents the conditions matter-of-factly. The temperatures, the road surfaces, the vehicle losses, the ammunition expenditure. It does not editorialize. The facts do not require it. What the after-action reports do not record, because after-action reports are not written for this purpose, is what George Patton thought about the men his army had been fighting. That is in a different place. In his diary, in his letters to his wife Beatrice, in the recollections gathered from his staff officers in the years after the war. And what it shows is a consistent and detailed professional assessment of the German army as an institution. The quality of its infantry, the flexibility of its command arrangements, the way its formations maintained cohesion under sustained pressure that had dissolved comparable organizations in previous wars. This was not a fringe view among Allied professionals. When Heinz Guderian, the Wehrmacht's foremost practitioner of armored warfare, was interrogated after the German surrender, he described Patton's campaign through France in a statement that has been preserved in the Hoover Institution's holdings on the German military. Guderian said that Patton had conducted a good campaign and that from the standpoint of a tank specialist, he congratulated him on his victory, adding that Patton had acted as Guderian himself would have done had he been in his place. That statement was made in captivity in an interrogation room about a man who had spent 9 months destroying Guderian's country's armies. It is not the language of a defeated man accommodating his captors. It is the language of one professional addressing another. Patton knew about German assessments of his campaigns. He was interested in them in the same way he was interested in everything that bore on the question of how armies succeeded and failed. By the spring of 45, he had been in close engagement with German formations for 2 years, from the North African desert to the Bavarian Alps, and he had arrived at conclusions about what the German army represented as a professional institution that were entirely separate, in his accounting, from any conclusion about the government that army had served. That separation was tested on the 12th of April, 1945, when Third Army units overran the Order of Subcamp of Buchenwald in central Germany and found what was there. Patton ordered every general officer in the vicinity to go and see. He went himself. The accounts from officers who were with him describe a man who was outwardly composed in the camp and who was physically sick afterward. He wrote in his diary that it was the most appalling thing he had ever seen in a career that had taken him through some of the worst industrial violence in human history. He understood, clearly and without qualification, what the German state had done. None of that changed his professional assessment of the German soldier. He held both conclusions simultaneously and regarded them as applicable to different questions. It was the particular cast of his mind, the ability to compartmentalize professional admiration and moral judgment, that made him a formidable army commander and that would prove catastrophic when applied to the problems of military governance in an occupied country. By June of 45, Patton was military governor of Bavaria. His Third Army headquarters at Bad Tölz administered a region that included Munich, the city where National Socialism had begun as a mass movement, and where the institutional traces of the Nazi state were threaded through the administration of every domain from the Austrian border to the Danube. The American occupation policy for what to do with those traces was codified in Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive 1067 and the implementing orders from Eisenhower's headquarters. Remove all Nazi party members from positions of authority in German civic administration, without exception and without delay. The policy covered teachers, judges, municipal engineers, doctors, police officers, anyone whose position had depended on or been advanced by party membership. Patton's objection to the implementation of this policy was not ideological. He was not defending National Socialism, and he said so explicitly on multiple occasions. His argument was administrative, that the Nazi Party had enrolled the overwhelming majority of Germany's experienced administrative class, that membership had been effectively required for anyone who wanted to hold a responsible position in any field from medicine to municipal engineering, and that removing all of them simultaneously would collapse the functioning governance of Bavaria before an alternative administrative class existed to replace them. You could pursue the denazification directive as written, or you could have running water. In some situations, he argued, you could not have both. This argument had some adherents. Eisenhower himself would later acknowledge, in a report on the occupation, that it was not easy for a military government officer to dismiss the only waterworks engineer in a city because he had been an active Nazi Party member. The logic of the argument was real. The problem was what surrounded it in Patton's administration of Bavaria. There were meetings with German officers at 3rd Army headquarters that did not conform to any interrogation protocol and were not reported to Eisenhower's headquarters in the manner that the Supreme Commander's staff would have expected. There were conversations in the headquarters mess at Bad Tölz that witnesses from Patton's own staff later described as substantively different from the ordinary professional debriefings that occupation headquarters conducted with captured enemy commanders. And there were statements, in conversation, in letters, in the kind of semi-private remarks that anyone who had covered Patton through the war could have predicted would eventually reach the wrong set of ears, about the Soviet Union, about the German military establishment as a potential counterweight to Soviet expansion, and about the general direction of American policy in occupied Europe. Eisenhower had been patient. He had written to Patton directly in August, making the position of Supreme Headquarters explicit. The denazification directive would be implemented. The private engagements with German officers would stop. The public statements would reflect occupation policy rather than Patton's personal assessments. The letter was clear. Patton wrote back that he understood and would comply. The press conference was 3 weeks away. The morning of the 22nd of September, 1945, began at Bad Tölz the way most mornings in the Bavarian foothills begin in autumn. Clear, cold at the edges, the mountains showing the first blue shadow of the season along their ridgelines. The press corps assembled in a conference room at the former SS school headquarters. It was a routine affair by occupation standards. General Patton had been conducting press conferences since North Africa. He was, by any measure, an experienced subject of journalistic attention. He arrived carrying his riding crop. He was in a good temper, by the accounts of the correspondents present. He had been, as Time magazine would later report, keeping unusually quiet for some weeks, and the silence appeared to have run its course. A correspondent asked him about the continued employment of former Nazi Party members in the Bavarian civil administration. Patton looked at the room, tapped his riding crop, and said, "Well, I'll tell you. This Nazi thing, it's just like a Democratic-Republican election fight." He elaborated. He said he was not trying to be king of Bavaria. He said he hated the Nazis as much as anyone. He said that more than half the German people had been party members, and you would be in a very difficult position if you tried to remove all of them from administrative life. He said most Nazis had simply been required to join, or had joined because it was useful, and that the distinction between the committed ideologues and the ordinary population of a totalitarian state was more complicated than the policy assumed. The conference lasted perhaps 15 minutes. The wire reports reached newspapers across the United States by that evening. By the following morning, the dispatches had landed on desks in Washington. The coverage was immediate and unfavorable in a way that the previous summer's complaint from occupation headquarters had not been. Patton's statement was not a private letter to Eisenhower. It was not an internal memorandum of objection to a policy. It was a general officer in front of the international press comparing the Nazi Party to the Republican and Democratic parties of the United States, in a country where the evidence of what the Nazi Party had done was still being entered into the record at Nuremberg, 40 miles to the north. Eisenhower was in Frankfurt. He read the reports. He sent his political advisor, Robert D. Murphy, to Bavaria to begin a formal investigation of Patton's administration. He summoned Patton to Frankfurt. What passed between the two men in Frankfurt was not recorded in any document that has been found in the public archives of either. Eisenhower's diary for that period is spare. Patton's is careful. Contemporary accounts of the meeting from Time magazine described the scene afterward. Eisenhower's face was stern. Patton, who emerged from the office behind him, was smiling. Neither man said anything for the cameras. The situation in Bavaria was adjusted. Patton accepted the resignation of the Bavarian minister-president, Friedrich Schäfer, who had himself been a Nazi party member, and installed Wilhelm Hoegner, a veteran social democrat with a documented anti-Nazi record going back years before the war. The dismissals and reinvestigations that Eisenhower's headquarters had been demanding through the summer were accelerated. The administrative changes were real. But Patton was not yet finished talking. He called a second press conference, at which he characterized the original statement as a problem of unfortunate analogies and startling newspaper headlines rather than a problem of substance. He then added that so vile a thing as National Socialism could not, in any case, be gotten rid of overnight. Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, held his own press conference at Supreme Headquarters the same week and told the assembled correspondents that General Eisenhower would tolerate no insubordination from his subordinate commanders. The phrase appeared in the newspapers. The formal order came on the 7th of October, 1945. Patton was relieved of command of Third Army. The command was transferred to General Lucian Truscott, who had distinguished himself in the Italian campaign and was regarded as a safe pair of hands for the occupation's political requirements. Patton was reassigned to the command of the 15th Army, a headquarters organization at Bad Nauheim with no combat formations, no operational responsibility, and a single assigned mission: to compile the historical record of American operations in the European theater. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He understood what it was. His diary entries from October do not require any interpretive work. The Third Army, his creation, the formation he had built from a staff and a flag into the most effective offensive command the American Army had deployed in Europe, was someone else's now. He was 60 years old. The war he had spent 30 years preparing for was over. The enemy he had studied, fought, and in a specific professional sense admired had been destroyed. The mission he had been privately articulating for months, a confrontation with Soviet power in Eastern Europe, was not one the United States was going to ask him to execute. He worked on the history assignment. He attended to the paperwork of a shrinking headquarters. He wrote letters about going home. He told people he had been, in the phrase that appeared in several accounts, kicked upstairs. He was planning to return to the United States in mid-December, to retire from the Army, to write a book about the campaigns. The morning of Sunday, the 9th of December, was clear and cold at Bad Nauheim. Patton was going pheasant hunting with General Hobart Gay, his longtime chief of staff, in the Rhine plains south of Mannheim. His regular driver was unavailable. A young Kentucky private first class named Horace Woodring had become his regular chauffeur in recent months, after the man who had driven him through most of the war went home in May. Ahead of the main car, a sergeant named Spruce drove a jeep with the hunting dogs and the guns. Patton was in a reflective mood, by Gay's account. He was talking about going home. He was looking at the landscape along the road, the warehouses and supply depots and salvage yards that still lined the roads near Mannheim, the detritus of an army in the process of leaving a country it had spent 2 years fighting to enter. He was commenting, Gay recalled afterward, on the litter that the war had left behind, piled up on both sides of the road, near the quartermaster area. It was approximately 1:15 p.m. Woodring was traveling on Highway N38, the Kaffrdelstrasse, north of Mannheim, approaching the entrance to a Class 2 and 4 supply warehouse on the right side of the road. Coming the opposite direction was a 2.5-ton GMC cargo truck. Without signaling, the truck turned left across the road into the warehouse entrance. Woodring hit the brakes. He estimated his speed at 30 to 35 miles per hour. He did not have sufficient distance. The Cadillac struck the truck on its passenger side. The impact was low speed by any mechanical standard. The vehicles were traveling toward each other, not at high combined velocity, and the damage to the cars was not extensive. The people in the truck were shaken. Woodring and General Gay were shaken. The hunting dog in the back of the car ran off. George Patton was thrown forward from the rear seat into the steel partition separating the front and rear compartments. He struck it with sufficient force to fracture his neck at the third and fourth cervical vertebrae. He was conscious. He did not panic. He told Gay he could not move. He told Woodring at the scene that the accident was not Woodring's fault. He asked whether his nose was broken, which was not. He lay in the rear seat, paralyzed from the neck down, waiting for the ambulance. He was taken to the 130th Station Hospital at Heidelberg, where the neurosurgical staff established the nature of the injury within hours. The fracture dislocation at C3 and C4 was complete. He was not going to recover the use of his body. The question for the medical staff from that point forward was not of rehabilitation, but of how long the other systems would hold. Beatrice flew from the United States and was with him through December. He was lucid for most of the first 2 weeks. He was read to, dictated letters, received a small number of visitors. Eisenhower came to the hospital once, toward the middle of the month, by most accounts a brief and difficult visit. Nothing from that conversation was recorded. By the 20th of December, Patton had told Beatrice he did not think he was going to get better. He was correct. The following morning, he developed pulmonary edema, the result of a blood clot that had reached his lungs. He died at 10 minutes to 6 in the evening of the 21st of December, 1945. He was 60 years old. He had been scheduled to fly home to the United States 11 days earlier. He was buried at the American Military Cemetery at Ham, in Luxembourg, at his own request. More than 5,000 soldiers of the Third Army are buried there, in rows on a hillside above a quiet valley. His headstone stands at the head of the main avenue of graves. It is a white Latin cross, identical in form to the ones around it. The only distinction is his rank and name. The detail that the accounts always note and move past is that George Patton was not killed by the enemy. He was not killed in combat. He was not killed by the German artillery that had been falling in his vicinity with some regularity for the better part of 3 years, nor by the Luftwaffe, nor by any of the dozen other lethal mechanisms that a combat theater offers to men who insist on positioning themselves at its forward edge. He survived the war entirely, and he was killed on a Sunday morning 6 months after the German surrender by a left-turning army supply truck on a road in the country he had helped to conquer the day before he was going home. There's nothing clean about that. It does not resolve into a lesson. But the other part of the story, the part from Bad Tölz from the gate of the SS-Junkerschule, from the moment when a Wehrmacht general declined to render a proper salute, does carry something worth holding on to if you look at it from the right angle. The thing Patton was trying to do in Bavaria was not forgiveness. He did not characterize it that way, and the evidence suggests he did not think in those terms. What he was trying to preserve was a distinction that the post-war world had decided on defensible grounds it could not afford to honor. The distinction between the professional soldier, the man who had spent his life in service to an institution that existed before National Socialism and would, in various forms, exist after it, and the regime that soldier had served. Patton believed the distinction was real. He believed it was meaningful. He believed the German general at the gate had earned the right to have the salute received correctly, soldier to soldier, and that Patton himself was obliged to receive it in that spirit and to extend it in kind. That belief was not an endorsement of what Germany had done. It was not naivety about what the occupation needed to accomplish. It was a professional soldier's insistence on a category, the craft of arms, the community of men who had trained their entire lives for the same thing and who recognized each other across the lines that divided them, that the post-war world, with very good reason, was determined to dismantle. It cost him his command. It cost him the army he had built. And then, before he could find out whether any of it had been worth it, a supply truck made a left turn without signaling on a road north of Mannheim, and the question was closed. He lies at Ham, among his men, under a quiet hillside in Luxembourg. The rows are straight. The crosses are even. It is exactly the kind of order he would have insisted on. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.